It was the kind of weekend I needed. Quiet, isolated, and far away from the chaos of city life. I had rented a small cabin in northern New Mexico, just outside of Santa Fe. The plan was to spend a couple of days hiking, maybe even trying some fishing in the nearby river. I had been feeling overwhelmed with work lately, so this was supposed to be a break, a way to reset. But nothing about this trip turned out how I expected. The cabin itself was tucked away in the trees, the kind of place that, if you didn't know it was there, you would never find it. It was built out of weathered wood, a simple structure with a small porch and a single window that looked out into the thick pine forest. A dirt road led up to the place, winding its way through the trees, only passable by a rugged 4x4 or a pickup. I had arrived just before sundown, and the first thing I noticed was how eerily quiet it was. There was no sound except the distant rustle of the wind moving through the trees and the faint chirp of crickets. No traffic, no planes overhead, just the sound of nature, and even that felt muted, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. I parked the truck and grabbed my duffel bag from the back. The air was crisp, but not cold. Just enough of a bite to let you know you were far from the comforts of city life. I took a deep breath, the smell of pine filling my lungs. There were no neighbors around, and the nearest town was about 20 miles away. This was as remote as it got. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me. The cabin was small, with a cozy feel to it. A few pieces of mismatched furniture, an old couch, a coffee table, a small stove in the corner. The kitchen had a small fridge, a sink, and a single pot on the stove. The walls were bare, except for a couple of old paintings, scenic views of mountains and forests. It felt like the kind of place someone might stay in if they were looking to hide from the world. There was a sense of abandonment here, but not in a depressing way. More like a retreat. I spent the first evening unpacking my gear, settling into the place, and then walking around the nearby forest. It was beautiful. The towering trees, the rustling leaves, the distant sounds of animals moving through the underbrush. I didn't run into anyone. I didn't expect to. This was supposed to be a solitary experience, and I embraced it. I made some dinner, a simple canned soup, and sat by the stove with a book. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and soon I had to stoke the fire to keep the chill out. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind pick up outside, I felt an odd sense of unease. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like an unsettling awareness, like I was being watched. The cabin was quiet, but it felt like there was something just beyond the trees, something I couldn't quite place. I chalked it up to being alone in the wilderness. It was easy to imagine things when you weren't used to the solitude. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I decided to go for a hike before breakfast, hoping to shake off the weird feeling I had the night before. The forest was even more breathtaking in the daylight. The trees were dense, the ground soft with pine needles. As I walked, I came across an old, half-fallen log that looked like it had been there for decades. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and take in the view. The air smelled fresh, the kind of scent you only get in the woods. There was something peaceful about it, but also something unsettling. It was as if the woods were full of secrets, ones I wasn't meant to know. I kept walking, following a narrow trail that seemed to disappear into the deeper parts of the forest. The trail was faint, hardly visible, but it was there. I had read about people getting lost in these woods, and I made a mental note to turn back soon. But as I walked deeper into the trees, the feeling of being watched came back, stronger this time. It wasn't just in my mind. I could almost feel the weight of eyes on me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just my imagination running wild. But when I turned around to head back to the cabin, something caught my eye. A movement in the trees, just a flicker, like someone darting behind the trunk of a tree. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. Could have been an animal. Could have been the wind. But something in my gut told me otherwise. I stood there, motionless, straining my ears for any sound. The forest around me was unnervingly quiet now, as if even the birds had stopped chirping. Then I heard something. A faint crunch of leaves underfoot, far off, but unmistakable. Someone was definitely out there. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was another hiker. Maybe it was someone else who had rented a cabin nearby. But the logical part of my brain was starting to panic. I wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. I turned quickly and started heading back toward the cabin, my pace quickening. The crunching behind me grew louder, closer. I could hear the heavy footsteps now, unmistakable. Someone was following me. My mind raced. Should I keep walking? Should I run? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't let whoever it was catch up. My legs were starting to burn from the rapid pace, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. I could feel the presence growing closer, closer. Then, just as I reached the cabin's clearing, I heard a shout, a hoarse, ragged voice calling out to me. I froze in place, my heart hammering in my chest. It was too far for me to make out the words, but the tone was desperate. I didn't turn around. I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My mind was racing. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The forest outside was still, but I could feel that presence lurking just beyond the walls. Whoever it was had to be out there. There was no mistaking it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every crack of a branch in the wind made me jump. I kept the lights low, hoping to avoid drawing attention to myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to matter if they came for me. The next day, I decided to leave. The cabin was no longer the peaceful getaway I had envisioned. I packed up my things quickly and quietly, trying not to make any noise. The thought of staying another night felt unbearable. I didn't care that I hadn't finished my hike or that I hadn't seen the full beauty of the forest. Something told me that I was no longer welcome there. As I drove down the winding dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The trees on either side seemed to close in, like they were hiding something. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something lurking behind me, but there was nothing. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent. I didn't look back until I reached the main highway. Even then, I couldn't fully relax until the cabin was miles behind me, and the weight on my chest lifted just a little. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back there. That place, with its beautiful views and its quiet isolation, had become a trap, and I had narrowly escaped. As I drove away, I finally allowed myself to breathe again. The further I got, the more the feeling of being watched faded. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. That cabin had been hiding something I wasn't meant to find, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. The rain started lightly at first, a soft pitter-patter against the roof of the old cabin. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, almost like a constant drumming. It had been one of those days where everything felt off, and the more I drove down the narrow dirt roads leading to the cabin, the more I questioned my decision to come here in the first place. But I needed the peace, the silence. My mind was too full, and I thought being alone in this cabin would give me the space to think, or at the very least to get away from everything for a while. The cabin wasn't much, just an old, weathered structure tucked away in the middle of nowhere, somewhere north of Lancaster, where the closest neighbor was miles away. The place had been in my family for generations, but it had long been abandoned, left to the elements after my grandfather passed. No one ever seemed to care to fix it up, and I was fine with that. I didn't mind the isolation. I didn't mind the way the floor creaked underfoot or how the windows rattled in the wind. It all felt familiar, like a piece of my past that I could hold on to, untouched by time. I parked my truck in front of the cabin and grabbed my bag, the door groaning as I pulled it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and aged wood, the faint scent of something moldy hidden beneath. The place hadn't been lived in for years. The kitchen was still stocked with old cans of beans and soup, some of which were far past their expiration date. I didn't plan to stay long enough to need any of them, but I couldn't help but look around. The furniture was sparse, just a few chairs, a couch that had seen better days, and an old wood-burning stove that still had some remnants of ash in it from its last use. I set my bag down on the couch, glancing around as the rain began to pour harder, a relentless sheet of water slapping against the windows. I checked the time around 5 p.m. and figured I had a few hours of daylight left, but not much. I started a fire in the stove, the crackling warmth filling the space. The heat from the fire made the cabin feel a little more like home, a little less lonely. Still, something about being here by myself, in the middle of nowhere, made my skin crawl. It wasn't the cabin itself. It wasn't even the isolation. It was the silence, the kind of silence that pressed in on you, the kind that makes you question if you're really alone. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. After all, I had been working nonstop for months. This was supposed to be my escape, my way of clearing my head. So, I pulled up the old chair by the fire and grabbed a book from my bag, trying to lose myself in the pages. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, the sound of the rain kept gnawing at me. It wasn't normal rain. It was something heavier, more insistent, and every so often, there was a sound beneath the rain, a soft thud or creak, almost like something was moving around outside. But when I checked the windows, nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was probably just a branch shaking in the wind. The rain had kicked up so much that the trees were swaying with the gusts. It was easy to mistake the sound of the wind for something else, right? Right. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the walls, and eventually, I couldn't fight the sleepiness that settled over me. I'd been driving for hours, after all, so I stretched out on the couch, pulling a blanket over myself. I didn't want to sleep, but my eyes were too heavy, and the warmth from the fire made it hard to stay awake. I drifted off into a restless sleep, my mind still buzzing with noise. And then, somewhere in the back of my consciousness, I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, almost like something was dragging along the ground just outside the cabin. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a scraping, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, walking slowly across the porch. I held perfectly still, not daring to move, barely breathing. The air felt thick, heavy. My instincts screamed at me to get up, to look outside, but a part of me, the same part that had been in denial all afternoon, wanted to believe it was just an animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe, but the more I listened, the less it sounded like an animal. It was deliberate, too deliberate. I slowly got up from the couch, my legs stiff from the awkward position I'd slept in. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight on the table, the beam cutting through the darkness of the room as I crept toward the window. The sound from outside continued, the scraping followed by that slow, deliberate pace across the porch. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I couldn't see anything through the rain, couldn't make out any figures in the darkness. The beam from my flashlight bounced off the window, catching only the blurry, gray outlines of the trees and the outline of the cabin's porch. But then, something caught my eye, a movement at the edge of the porch. It was quick, too quick. But there was something there. Someone, maybe. My breath hitched in my chest as I took a step back from the window, my mind racing. The sound of footsteps stopped for a moment, and all I could hear was the beating of my own heart in my ears. And then, a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped on the porch, followed by a shuffling noise, and I froze in place. There was someone out there. My first instinct was to grab my keys, to rush out the door and get to my truck, but something in me hesitated. The rain was so thick outside, and the visibility was so low, I wouldn't make it far. Plus, there was no one for miles around. If I left, I'd be completely on my own, vulnerable, and exposed. I couldn't risk that, not after what I'd already heard. I retreated into the back of the cabin, grabbing the old baseball bat my grandfather had left behind. The feeling of it in my hands, the weight of it was oddly comforting. At least I'd have something to defend myself with if it came to that. I moved back to the front of the cabin, crouching low behind the sofa, the light from my flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the room. The rain continued its relentless assault against the cabin, but now I could hear something else. The shuffling on the porch had started again. Slower this time, closer. I pressed my back against the wall, listening intently, trying to gather my courage. I didn't know what I was dealing with, who I was dealing with, but my gut told me that whoever it was had no intention of leaving anytime soon. They were out there watching, waiting. Then, without warning, the front door creaked open. My heart jumped into my throat as the door swung wide, the sound of the wind and rain rushing in. I could barely make out the figure standing in the doorway, shrouded in the storm, their features hidden by the dark. But there was no mistaking the shape, tall, imposing, and far too still. I didn't think. I acted. With the bat in hand, I bolted toward the door, swinging the heavy wood with everything I had. The figure stepped back, but not quickly enough. The bat landed with a sickening thud. The person grunted, staggering back, but didn't fall. Instead, they let out a low growl that made my blood run cold. I had no idea who or what this person was, but I didn't care. I swung again, this time landing a blow against their chest, and they finally stumbled back, collapsing onto the porch. I didn't wait. I turned and ran for the back door, slamming it shut behind me, the sound of my breathing echoing in my ears as I fumbled to lock it. Outside, the storm raged on, and in the distance I thought I saw movement. Another figure, a second person, but I couldn't wait to find out. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get to the truck and drive as fast as I could. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and ran out the back, not daring to look behind me. I wasn't sure how long I ran, but eventually, I reached the truck, and the engine roared to life as I sped away, leaving the cabin behind. And as I drove, the rain poured down, but the silence felt different now, more oppressive, more unsettling. I didn't look back, and I never went back. It had been years since I had been in the French countryside. I was 28 now, far older than the last time I came here, and this time I was alone. It was early October, just on the edge of fall, the kind of season where the mornings are crisp and the days still carry the lingering warmth of summer. I was tired, worn down by life. Between the stress of my job in Paris and the complications of city life, I felt like I needed to get away. The old family cabin in the middle of nowhere sounded like the perfect place to escape. The place was remote, miles away from the nearest village, tucked deep in a thicket of pine trees. My great-uncle had built the cabin when he was young, decades ago. He had long passed, but the cabin still stood sturdy, though its age showed in the crumbling stone and weather-beaten wood. The key was still under the same rock out front, just like he had told me years ago. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I figured that being here would allow me some peace, a chance to breathe and regroup before heading back to the chaos of daily life. I drove through the winding roads that led into the forest, the familiar silence of the woods pressing in. The forest was thick, the trees rising tall like silent sentinels. I didn't mind. I'd always felt a connection to nature. As I passed a few rusted old farmhouses, I could feel my unease growing, but I brushed it off. It was just the solitude. I wasn't used to being alone anymore. In the city, the noise never stops. Here, everything was quiet. Eventually, I pulled up to the cabin. It was just as I remembered. Small, with a faded red roof, surrounded by overgrown shrubbery. The path leading to the door was uneven, and the old stone steps were cracked. I could already tell that the cabin had not been maintained for years, though it still had a strange charm to it. I grabbed my backpack from the car, walked to the door, and retrieved the key from the familiar hiding spot. The lock creaked, the door groaning as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the kind of smell that comes from a place left untouched for too long. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped in. It was colder than I expected, even for a fall day. The windows were boarded up, allowing only a few slivers of light to pierce the gloom. I turned on the lights, but they flickered before settling into a dim glow. Nothing worked perfectly here, and that was fine by me. I didn't need comfort. I needed isolation. I unpacked my things and started a small fire in the fireplace. It crackled, sending warmth throughout the room. The flames danced, casting strange shadows on the walls. As the fire burned, I began to feel the weight of the silence. There was no wind, no sound of animals, just the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. It was unnerving, but I tried not to think too much about it. The more I focused on the quiet, the more I realized how alone I was, how far removed from everything. I sat in the worn leather chair by the fire, sipping a glass of wine, staring into the flames. The night drew closer, and the temperature dropped even further. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders, the flickering light casting long shadows around the room. It was almost surreal, this quiet, this sense of being completely cut off from the world. For the first time in a long time, I felt a weight lift off my chest. This place was exactly what I needed. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside. I could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, serene. I made a cup of coffee and stepped outside to take in the view of the forest. The mist had settled in, swirling between the trees like a ghostly veil. The air was thick, but there was something calming about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, though. A subtle sense of discomfort lingered in the back of my mind, but I didn't acknowledge it. It was probably nothing. The second day was uneventful. I spent the morning exploring the surrounding woods, taking in the fresh air, and getting lost in my thoughts. By late afternoon, I decided to take a walk further into the woods, beyond the familiar paths I knew from childhood. As I wandered deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, the ground muddier. It felt like the woods were closing in on me, and though I didn't want to admit it, I could feel a presence, a watchful gaze. I stopped by a small stream to rest, sitting on a large rock, staring at the water as it rushed past. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The quiet had returned, and in that silence, I felt something stir. I couldn't place it, just a deep, instinctual feeling that something was off. When I opened my eyes, I saw something, movement. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer perhaps, but when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a figure standing still just beyond the trees. My heart rate spiked. It wasn't anyone I knew, not anyone who would be out here. I stood up quickly, trying to get a better look, but by the time I did, the figure had disappeared. I froze, my mind racing. Was it someone else lost in the woods? The thought gave me a slight sense of relief, but something didn't sit right. The woods were vast, and the figure had been far too still, too quiet. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I tried to shake it off, but as the evening settled in, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. I bolted the door behind me, an unnecessary precaution, but I did it anyway. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the unease still crept up on me. I stayed close to the fire, keeping my eyes on the shadows in the corners of the room. Night fell, and once again, the silence settled in around me. I tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched kept me awake. I finally drifted off, but not for long. I was awoken in the dead of night by a sound outside the cabin, something scraping against the wood. It wasn't a branch moving in the wind or an animal scurrying. No, this was deliberate, slow. My heart raced as I lay still in bed, listening. The sound came again, a scraping, then a thud, followed by silence. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, peering out through a crack in the boarded-up boards. There was nothing there, no person, no animal, just the darkened woods, empty and still. But I knew something had been out there. I could feel it. The night stretched on, each hour dragging on longer than the last. I barely slept, my mind racing with every creak of the cabin. When the morning light finally broke through the trees, I stepped outside, hoping to shake off the dread that had settled over me. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, at the edge of the forest, was a set of footprints. They were fresh, barely disturbed by the morning dew. My blood ran cold. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, and they were coming from the direction of the cabin. I turned to look at the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. Had someone been watching me last night? Had they been the one scraping at the door? I felt a tightness in my chest as the realization hit me. I was not alone. I didn't wait around to investigate. I grabbed my things, packed what I could, and drove back to the village. I couldn't get out of the woods fast enough. The drive back felt endless, the road twisting and turning in a blur. By the time I made it to the main road, the adrenaline had begun to fade, leaving only a lingering fear in my gut. I never went back to the cabin. The strange figure, the scraping noises, and the footprints, whatever was out there, it wasn't something I could explain. I never found out who or what had been watching me in the woods, but I never needed to know. The cabin was better left behind, a memory of something far too unsettling to return to. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the smell of damp wood and rotting leaves. It was early autumn, and the forest around me was a patchwork of browns, yellows, and fading greens. I had been planning this weekend getaway for months, desperate for some quiet time alone. It wasn't the kind of vacation I normally took. No beach resorts or city escapes. This was a cabin, tucked away deep in the woods, hours from any town. The cabin was old, really old. I'd found it online, a little listing that promised solitude and comfort. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was exactly what I needed. Peace and quiet, and a chance to clear my head after a stressful year. I'd arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky as I unpacked my car. The cabin itself sat back from the main road, nestled into the side of a small hill. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs that were beginning to show their age, a little crooked but sturdy. There was a small porch with an old rocking chair on the front. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight, making the place seem even more isolated than it was. The door creaked when I opened it, and I couldn't help but notice how the smell of mold seemed to hit me immediately. The place had clearly been abandoned for a while. Dust covered every surface, and the wood floors looked like they hadn't been swept in months. There was a fireplace in the living room, surrounded by mismatched furniture. An old, sagging couch sat in the corner next to a low wooden coffee table. The place had a lived-in feel, but also the unmistakable presence of neglect. No one had stayed here for a long time. I set my bags down by the door and took a deep breath. Despite the disrepair, it was peaceful. The silence outside the cabin was thick, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. It was perfect, exactly what I had wanted. I spent the first few hours cleaning up, sweeping the dust from the floors, wiping down the kitchen counters, and opening up the windows to let in fresh air. The sun was dipping behind the trees by the time I finished, and I was exhausted, so I decided to light a fire in the hearth and settle in for the evening. I grabbed the stack of firewood from the porch and started the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. As night settled in, I made myself a simple dinner, a can of soup and a piece of bread, and ate while sitting in the chair next to the fire. The warmth from the flames spread through the room, making the cabin feel cozier. For the first time in months, I felt at ease. But then, something strange happened. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. At first, it didn't seem odd. Autumn winds were common in the woods. But then I heard something else. A soft, scratching sound coming from the door. I paused, my spoon hovering mid-air, listening. It wasn't loud, just a faint noise, like something was dragging along the wooden surface of the door. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, growing louder. I stood up and approached the door cautiously, my heart rate picking up. I opened it, but there was nothing outside, just the cold, dark woods stretching out in every direction. The wind whipped through the trees, but there was no sign of what had made the sound. I stood there for a few moments, scanning the darkness, trying to shake off the unease that had crept over me. The night was quiet once more. I closed the door and locked it, though I didn't feel much safer. The feeling of being watched was beginning to creep in, a slow, persistent thought that gnawed at the back of my mind. I tried to brush it off and went back to my dinner, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks up the chimney. I couldn't stop glancing at the door, though. It felt like something was out there, lurking just beyond the edges of the light. It wasn't until much later, when I had finished eating and was ready to settle into bed, that I realized the cabin had grown unnaturally cold. I wrapped myself in a blanket and turned in for the night, though sleep was elusive. The wind howled against the cabin, but it was the silence between gusts that felt heavier, more oppressive. That night, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps, heavy and almost purposeful. I froze, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. Someone or something was out there. The footsteps continued, pausing just beyond the edge of the cabin. They were too slow to be a passing animal, too regular to be a random occurrence. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, my eyes wide open in the darkness, trying to listen through the heavy silence. But nothing came. The footsteps never resumed. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe some animal in the woods playing tricks on my mind. I didn't want to leave the safety of the bed, but my instincts told me I needed to check. I had to be sure. I grabbed a flashlight from the side table and slowly made my way to the door. My hands were trembling as I gripped the handle, but I turned it anyway. The door opened with a groan, revealing nothing but the dark, empty porch. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The beam cut through the darkness, but everything seemed normal. The trees swayed in the wind, the leaves rustling softly. Still, something didn't feel right. Then I saw it. Just beyond the porch, in the shadows of the trees, a figure stood motionless. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was too still, too silent. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape against the blackness of the woods. I didn't move. My mind raced, but I couldn't find any logical explanation for what I was seeing. Was it a person? An animal? A trick of the light? Then, the figure stepped forward, just a bit, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the door shut, the cold metal lock clicking into place. I backed away from the door, my mind spinning with questions, but no answers. There was no way I could sleep now. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, the flashlight in my hand, watching the door. My thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear: I wasn't alone. By morning, the feeling of dread had only deepened. The sun rose, casting a pale light over the trees, but it didn't ease my unease. I decided to leave the cabin. I grabbed my things, packed my car, and left before the day could fully unfold. As I drove away, I took one last look at the cabin. It sat there, still and silent, nestled in the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time I had been there. It wasn't until weeks later, when I spoke to the owner of the cabin, that I learned the truth. Apparently, a man had gone missing in those woods years ago. He'd been staying in a cabin just a few miles from mine. They never found his body, just a trail of blood leading into the trees. And the footsteps I had heard, they were a warning. I'll never know who or what I saw that night, but I've never been back to those woods, and I never will. The forest was silent when I arrived at the cabin. I remember that part clearly. It had been one of those rare days when the weather was perfect, overcast, cool, not a breath of wind. It was just before dusk, and everything felt still. Too still, almost. The kind of quiet that you could feel creeping up your spine. The cabin was hidden deep in the woods. I had been told it was my great-uncle's old hunting lodge, but it felt more like a forgotten piece of history. The gravel road leading up to it was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck to fit. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the thought that I might be the first person to drive down this path in years, maybe even decades. I had decided to spend the weekend alone. After everything that had happened in the last few months, I needed some space. I needed to be away from people, away from the noise of life. The cabin had always been a kind of retreat for my uncle, a man of few words and even fewer visitors. When he passed, no one had shown much interest in the place. It had been left to me, not that I had known about it until recently, but something about the solitude of the woods, the quiet and the promise of nothing, was exactly what I needed. The cabin itself looked worn. The wood was old and faded, the shingles on the roof missing in places, the windows boarded up with hastily nailed planks. It looked abandoned, like no one had cared for it in years. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the truck, and I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I grabbed my gear, making sure to bring everything I thought I might need. Food, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit. It wasn't that I expected anything bad to happen. I just knew it was better to be prepared. There was a stillness in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off as nothing more than my nerves settling in. Inside the cabin, dust had gathered on every surface, and the smell of musty wood and old leather filled the air. The furniture was minimal. A couple of chairs, a small wooden table, a faded couch by the window that faced out into the woods. There was a fireplace, stone and sturdy, with a pile of firewood stacked beside it. The whole place felt like it hadn't seen a living soul in years. I spent the first few hours settling in, trying to get comfortable. I opened the windows to let in what little fresh air there was, but the quiet was unsettling. I didn't know why it bothered me so much, but there was something about the silence, about the way it seemed to press in on me, that didn't feel right. The woods outside seemed too empty, the trees too still. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the hearth. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and then cleaned up. It was during the cleanup that I first heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the sound was persistent, deliberate, almost like something was pacing around the cabin. I froze, the dish I was holding slipping from my hands and crashing to the floor. I stood there, listening. The scratching continued, and then, for a moment, everything stopped. The silence returned, and I couldn't tell if it was worse now that the noise had stopped or if it had been more unsettling before. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and slowly made my way to the door. I didn't open it right away, but I peered through the cracks in the old wood. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees. More trees, nothing moving. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I tried to brush it off as nothing. Maybe an animal had been caught in the wind, or maybe it was just my nerves. But then the scratching returned, louder this time, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin, where the windows were boarded up. I crept toward the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought it was going to die on me. But it stayed on, its beam cutting through the dark like a knife. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what it was. I slowly unlatched the door, the noise of the mechanism echoing in the cabin. Stepping outside, I scanned the area around the cabin, my flashlight moving back and forth across the trees and ground. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I saw it. A shadow moved near the edge of the woods. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was a figure, barely visible, standing between the trees just out of the light's reach. I called out, but my voice felt weak, like it wasn't mine. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, but that was when the scratching started again, coming from the opposite side of the cabin. And then from behind me, I heard it. Something moving, something heavy. I spun around, but by the time I did, there was nothing there. No figure, no sound, just the rustling of the leaves in the trees. The air felt thick now, heavy, like the weight of something unseen was pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do. I went back inside, locking the door again, and tried to calm myself down. The fire was still burning brightly in the hearth, but the warmth seemed to be gone now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Every creak of the cabin, Every crack of the fire made my heart race. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I just sat there, waiting for something to happen, for the next sound, the next movement. But nothing came. By morning, I was exhausted but felt the strange sense that I had somehow made it through the worst of it. The scratching, the figure, the strange sounds, they were gone. The cabin was still. The woods were still. The world outside felt far away, distant, like it belonged to someone else. I packed my things and left, not bothering to check the cabin one last time. I didn't need to. I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had heard. And whatever it was, I didn't want to stay another minute. The drive out of the woods was a blur. The roads seemed longer, the trees darker, and I didn't look back. I hadn't spoken to my stepsister Leanne much in the past few years, not because of any real reason. Life just kind of pulled us in different directions. I worked at a parts warehouse down in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and spent most of my time alone when I wasn't clocked in. She married a cop, some guy named Rick, and they moved up north closer to the West Virginia border. He worked highway patrol or something similar. Not the kind of guy I ever figured she'd end up with, but she seemed happy. That's what mattered. It was late September of 2017 when she invited me out to stay at a cabin Rick had inherited from his uncle. Said they'd been fixing it up here and there when they had time, and that it was about ready for people to stay over. They were planning a little weekend out there, just the three of us. I didn't ask why, but later I understood they wanted someone else there. Not for fun, but for safety. I didn't know that part when I said yes. I drove up Friday morning in my old Ford Ranger, taking the back roads past New Market and into the mountains. By the time I made it up to the ridge at Dalton Creek, the sun was nearly overhead. The road to the cabin wasn't marked, just a gap in the trees with a metal cattle gate that had been pushed open. The truck bounced over ruts and rocks as I crawled through dense forest. Pine needles blanketed the road. Smelled like wet moss and old wood. Kind of peaceful. The cabin was tucked up on a slope that overlooked a narrow, winding creek. It was smaller than I expected. Single story, wide porch, green roof stained dark by the rain and years. A chimney on one side, the kind of place that looked abandoned from the outside, except for Rick's Dodge Charger parked just off the gravel turnaround. Leanne came out to greet me, looking thinner than I remembered. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore a fleece over jeans. Rick stood behind her on the porch, arms crossed, scanning the woods like he was working a case. I noticed it right away. Something was off. They weren't acting like a couple out on a weekend trip. They looked tired, both of them, like they hadn't slept. Inside the cabin was warmer than expected. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. The air smelled of split pine and old blankets. There were only 2 bedrooms and a small kitchen. No TV, no radio, no cell service. Leanne had me bunk in the smaller room. I dropped my duffel on the bed and went back out. Rick was sitting at the table, going over something in a black notebook. I didn't ask. It wasn't my business. I figured he was working out some police paperwork. That evening we ate chili Leanne had made, drank some beer, and sat out on the porch under the stars. Should have been relaxing, should have been quiet, but every few minutes, Rick would get up and sweep a flashlight across the trees. Leanne flinched each time he did. I didn't ask questions that night. The next morning, Rick was gone. His car was still there, but he wasn't inside or around the cabin. I woke up to the sound of Leanne pacing the kitchen floor. She told me he'd gone to check the trail that led down the ridge, said he did it every morning, like clockwork. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and waited on the porch. Sunlight bled through the trees, warming the damp earth. I saw no sign of him. By noon, she was getting worried. By 1, she was in tears. She finally told me everything. Over the last few months, Rick had been driving up to this cabin after work, checking things out. Someone or something had been coming up onto the property. He kept finding boot prints in the dirt around the cabin. Things moved inside the shed, scraps of fabric caught on trees, weird little things out of place. No sign of forced entry, but the shed door was twice found unlocked when he swore he'd latched it. The final straw had been when he saw a man, at least what he thought was a man, standing near the base of the ridge one night just before sunset. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes, didn't move, just stood there partly behind a tree. Rick yelled. The figure didn't respond. When Rick hiked down with his flashlight, the man was gone. He thought maybe it was a squatter, or someone using the place for drug runs, since it wasn't too far from the old forestry road. He hadn't told his station about it, said it wasn't worth writing up, but it bugged him. So now here we were. I hiked down the trail around 2, hoping to run into him. The trees grew tight together in that part of the forest, pines and old oaks casting long shadows even in daylight. There were old animal trails crisscrossing the hill. I followed the path about half a mile down to where the woods opened slightly. Found nothing. Then I saw the boot prints. They weren't fresh, but they weren't Rick's. He wore police-issue boots. These were something else, deeper tread, longer step. They led off the trail between 2 boulders and into a narrow gully. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before I stopped. The ground sloped steeply, slick with dead leaves. And then I smelled it. Something foul, wet metal and rot, came in waves, like something dead was down there. I backed out. I told Leanne when I got back. She didn't say much, just nodded and locked the doors. That night, Rick still didn't return. We stayed up late. The fire burned low, and the only light came from the oil lantern Leanne hung near the window. Every now and then, we both turned to look outside. The trees didn't move. The dark didn't give up anything. Then, around midnight, we heard it. Footsteps, crunching leaves just outside the back wall. Slow, measured, like someone walking in a wide circle around the cabin. Leanne grabbed Rick's sidearm from the top of the cupboard. She didn't hesitate. I stayed crouched near the table, watching the windows. The steps paused, then picked up again. Closer now. We both moved into the bedroom and killed the light. Silence. Then something scratched against the back wall. Light, deliberate, like a stick dragged across wood. It stopped after a few seconds. We stayed like that for over an hour, not speaking, not moving, just waiting. At dawn, we went out. No one was there, but we saw the trail, tracks leading around the cabin, prints spaced wide like someone pacing in a slow loop. Same tread as the ones I'd seen off the trail. Same direction, same distance between steps. But here's the thing, the tracks came up to the back wall and never turned around. No returning prints. That day, Leanne wanted to leave, but Rick's car keys were gone. We searched every room, every drawer. Nothing. His bag was still there. His badge, wallet, everything, except the keys. She swore they were on the table the night before. That afternoon, I hiked back down to the spot I'd found the smell. This time, I followed the gully deeper. I don't know what I expected. Maybe to find a deer carcass or an old fire pit. But what I saw was worse. I found a camp, small, rough, hidden in a hollow behind a stand of black pines. There was a tarp strung between trees, a pile of stripped sticks, burnt food cans, and a blackened pot. A rolled-up sleeping bag half buried under leaves. But no sign of anyone there now. Then I saw what really stopped me. Nailed into the tree behind the camp were dozens of small animal bones, strung up with twine, arranged in circles and spirals, cleaned, organized. I stood there, staring at it, unable to move. Then I saw something else, Rick's name, carved into the bark, just once, clean and straight. Not his full name, just Rick. Deep grooves, fresh. I turned and walked straight back up to the cabin. Told Leanne everything. We packed what we could in 30 minutes and started walking. We didn't wait. Took only what we could carry and followed the forestry road south, hoping to catch a car or find cell service. 3 hours later, a park ranger spotted us near the old trailhead. He called for backup. We were taken to the nearest sheriff's office and gave our statements. They sent 2 units to the cabin. They didn't find Rick. They did find the camp I described, but they didn't find anyone there, and the bones were gone. The following weeks were filled with interviews, follow-ups, search efforts. Leanne stayed with me in Harrisonburg for a while. She stopped sleeping. I barely ate. Rick's disappearance was filed as unresolved missing persons. No foul play determined. That was over 7 years ago. I haven't been back to that ridge since. The cabin was sold. The new owners cleared most of the trees around it, installed cameras, and put up new fencing. They say it's peaceful now, but I know better. Sometimes I still wonder what Rick saw out there, who he saw, or what he figured out too late. I think about the name carved into that tree, the footprints that stopped at the wall, the missing keys. I never asked for answers after that. I don't think I want them, and I don't think I'll ever step foot in those woods again. It was late in the fall, and the air had that crisp, biting chill that only comes when the leaves are just about gone, leaving behind bare branches that groaned under the weight of the wind. I didn't have a lot of time, but something told me I needed to be alone, away from everything. The weight of the world, or maybe just the weight of my thoughts, felt like too much lately. My uncle had passed away a few months earlier, and I hadn't had the chance to properly process it all. But now there was something else. An inheritance. My uncle, Charles, had owned a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. He'd lived there for as long as I could remember, even before I was born. The place was isolated, perched in the woods, surrounded by the remnants of an old cemetery, headstones worn down by years of neglect. It wasn't a place I'd ever thought about much. Not as a child, not as an adult. But now I was left to take care of it. The idea of returning there filled me with an odd mixture of dread and curiosity. A few family members had given their condolences and moved on, but I'd never been one to ignore things that needed to be done. I guess that's why I found myself standing in front of the cabin that afternoon, after a long drive through dirt roads and winding paths. The cabin itself was a simple, two-story structure with a wraparound porch and a couple of windows that looked out over the graveyard. The wood was aged and dark, its surface chipped and cracked from years of weather. It sat like a forgotten relic of the past, its only company being the graveyard that stretched beyond it. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the musty smell of wet leaves and old wood mixing with the sharp tang of the distant pine trees. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it, wondering if my uncle had really lived here alone all these years. The place was eerie, silent except for the occasional rustling of a squirrel or the distant call of a bird. But there was something unsettling about it. Maybe it was the graveyard, or maybe it was just the emptiness of the whole place. I shook it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. I had a job to do. There was no reason to get worked up over something as simple as a cabin. I walked up to the door and found it unlocked, which was strange. My uncle had always been a cautious man, and I was sure he would have kept the place locked. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my boots. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. Dust settled on every surface, and the smell of old leather and tobacco hung in the air. The cabin wasn't much to look at. It was furnished simply with a couch, a few chairs, a dining table, and a small kitchen. The fireplace was cold, and the bookshelves were lined with old, yellowing books. The walls were adorned with faded pictures of people I didn't recognize, along with a few of my uncle in his younger days. But it didn't feel like his home anymore. It felt like something else. I ventured further inside, feeling a strange sense of claustrophobia, as if the house was closing in on me. The staircase to the second floor was narrow and steep, and I hesitated for a moment before deciding to check out the rest of the house. Maybe it was because I didn't want to be in the main room alone, or maybe it was just that nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The second floor was even quieter than the first, if that was possible. It looked like a simple sleeping area with a bed, a couple of chairs, and an old writing desk. But there was something else here, something that caught my attention immediately. On the far wall, there was a large, worn-out cabinet. It looked out of place, and for a second, I wondered why my uncle had kept it. It wasn't his style. He was a minimalist in every sense of the word. But the cabinet was old, with brass handles that had long since tarnished. I opened it, and inside, I found a small collection of items that seemed almost out of context for the cabin. There were several old books, most of them on obscure topics, philosophy, history, and some that appeared to be handwritten journals. But the most curious thing was a small wooden box tucked away at the back of the cabinet. I took the box out and set it on the desk, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, with intricate carvings on the lid. I opened it slowly, expecting to find something insignificant, but inside, there was only one item: an old photograph. The picture was of my uncle standing in front of the cabin, but the image was faded and scratched. The strangest thing about it was the shadow in the background. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the longer I stared at it, the more it seemed wrong. The shadow was too distinct, too human, but it wasn't my uncle. I turned the photo over, and in small, careful handwriting it said, *, he's still here. Don't come back, *. A chill ran through me, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something much deeper than just the cabin itself. I stood there, staring at the photo, unsure of what to do next. I had been expecting something, a letter, a will, something practical to tell me what I was supposed to do with the cabin. But this was something else entirely. I decided to head outside for a bit to clear my head. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the graveyard. The wind had picked up, and the leaves rustled restlessly. I walked toward the graveyard, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. It was too quiet, too still. As I stepped between the rows of gravestones, I noticed something strange. There was one grave that looked different from the others. It was newer, the stone still pristine, with no signs of weathering. I walked closer, squinting to read the name etched into the stone. It read, * Charles M. Tiller, 1963 to 2020. *. I felt my heart skip a beat. My uncle's name, but that didn't make sense. He had died just a few months ago, and I had been there for the funeral. There was no way this grave could have been placed just recently. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out at me from behind a tree, but there was no one. I kneeled down and ran my fingers over the stone. The coldness of it sent another shiver through me. As I stood up, I noticed something else. A small patch of disturbed earth beside the grave. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me question what I was seeing. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a twig snapping. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the trees, the wind, and the endless expanse of the graveyard. But then, I saw something, movement, a flicker between the gravestones. I could just make out a figure, a person, standing among the tombstones, watching me. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. It had to be. The silence, the isolation, it was all getting to me. I turned and hurried back to the cabin, my pulse racing. The night fell quickly, and the cabin became even more oppressive, as though it were pressing in from all sides. I locked the door behind me and tried to focus on something, anything, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I could feel it, creeping along the walls, in the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. I decided to head to bed, hoping that sleep would come and give me some relief. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, I heard it again, a faint scratching sound. It came from the walls, faint at first, like someone or something was trying to get in. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was thumping, like something was being dragged across the floor above me. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. There was no one upstairs. The second floor was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs, the beam of light trembling in my hand. The noise stopped as soon as I reached the top. The room was exactly as I had left it, the air thick with dust and silence. I checked the windows, the doors, nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw it. At the edge of the room, near the back wall, there was a door I had missed before. It was partially open, just enough for me to see the dark, narrow hallway behind it. I walked toward it, the flashlight flickering in my hand. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw it. A hidden room, filled with old furniture, old trunks, and a coffin. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't supposed to be here. The room was sealed off, locked away. And yet, there it was. A wooden coffin, placed carefully on the floor, as though waiting for someone to open it. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and as I reached out to lift the lid, I heard it again. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the coffin, the dust, and the eerie silence of the cabin. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, my mind racing. I knew I had to leave, but something kept me there, rooted to the spot. I didn't know how much longer I stayed in that cabin,